Hello there, I'm Kath Flynn, the Executive Director of the National New Deal Preservation Association. That's a nonprofit organization that Jan and I and others got started in. Jan is Jan Marfyak, and we're here to talk to him today about his family history in the New Deal, and I bet we even get some stories about Jan, which would be very good for us. And we hope you will enjoy learning more about the New Deal and what all happened during the years of Franklin Roosevelt's as our president, which started 90 years ago. We are celebrating that, and we're glad to have Jan here to help us share and help us celebrate. Jan Marfyak.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Jan is one of our... Jan has been one of our board members practically since the very beginning of our organization. So we're glad to have him here today and tell us the stories about his father and his family. Because his father was one of the WPA artists. That's a work projects administration, which was one of the big programs that put artists to work and keep them from, starving to death. Right, Jan?
Yeah, a little background to begin with here. My dad was an immigrant to the United States. He came from a little town in eastern Czechoslovakia and came to the U.S. about They came through Ellis Island, and my father had a sister who was handicapped, and they managed to get her through. In Britton, where my grandfather was working at a foundry. And my dad grew up in basically a Slovak community in New Britain at the time, worked in a foundry. My dad went to New Britain High School, but his grade school was limited to parochial schools, Irish parochial schools. And interestingly enough, he went to school and graduated from 8th grade as Jan Marfyak. It was as close as the sisters could get to Jan Marfyak. He studied here at a small art school in Britton, Connecticut, and then moved to New York City and went to the Art Student League, which was at that time probably the premier painting school in the United States. Chong, Jackson Pollock, a number of noted painters either taught there or graduated from classrooms. He went on his own, did some banking work, and when the Depression hit, he took a job at a bank. And while he went to the Art Student, he continued that. Subsequent to that, he joined the WPA and was paid the minimal salaries that were available at the time. And we were there for about 3 years in New York City. We were at Greenwich Village. And then he was asked to come to New Mexico on loan from New York. And he came to Roswell, New Mexico during the Depression. We rented a house there in Roswell, just off the main artery running from New York to California. And I hesitate to use the term pokey, but that's what they were called. They were poor people who lost their farm during the dust storms of the 30s. As a consequence, we used to help out. Children would come at sunset, and we had milk and bread and such to help them on their way to California. We were there for 2 years. The local community was not interested in the WPA at all, and the board that governed the Kathy, what's the name of the institution that they had down there?
Yes, the Roswell Museum of Art.
But it was one of 3 art centers in the state.
Right, yes. Or 4, I think.
Maybe you could tell people a little bit about he did.
Well, this was a program of the WPA that they put art centers around the nation, and they put them to try to give opportunities for local artists to show their work, to learn and teach. So it was a great exposure for artists, and of course, it kept them from starving to death.
Yeah.
And we had 4 in New Mexico, and I may not remember them all: Melrose, Roswell, Gallup, and one other one, I'm sorry, I can't remember. But the only one that has survived is Roswell.
Yeah.
And it's a very fine art museum and teaching center there.
It's interesting, Kathy, when I visited there recently, to note that the original museum, actually the actual building, is still used, but it's incorporated into the new museum. And they use it as kind of a clearing hall. At that time, Roland Dickey was the curator and director, and he established a relationship with my dad that was pretty close. Roland later became editor of the University of New Mexico Press, and has written several books about New Mexico. Well, to continue on about my dad, he found that when he got to Roswell, the board that governed the local operation did not want him teaching what he was supposed to teach, which were Native Americans and Hispanics. So he made an arrangement on the side with a local Catholic priest who used one of their annexes to teach sketching. He did this for 2 years, and of course he visited a lot of sites in New Mexico, archaeological sites particularly, but Native American sites, and pretty much became New Mexicans at the time. New York wanted him back on the project. He was reluctant to go. New Mexico wanted to keep him. He had an opportunity to stay, but New York insisted that he come back. At that time, we moved back to Bleecker Street and in New York City, and he continued work continued work on a mural. We are unable to establish where it was and when it was. It's somewhere place in the United States. In any event, he worked on that until the beginning of the Second World War. He needed to find work when the war broke out because the federal projects that he was working on were dissolved. Interestingly enough, he joined a Washington group, which was basically a front organization for the OSS, and did bomb charts of Italy in Washington. He commuted from New York to Washington on Mondays and came home on Fridays. Following the Second World War, he continued to paint, do freelance work, and teach, taught at the vocational school in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was living at the time. Taught art there. But he had a rather long career, was dedicated to painting, basically understood the fundamentals, which a lot of artists still don't know today. But he...
say a little bit more about that.
Well, until the projects came along, federal projects came along, people didn't have pictures in their houses. At best, pictures were the yearly maps that were sent out, date schedules, but people didn't have pictures on their walls. And all of a sudden, art burst onto the scene. Europe had been a leader in artwork. America kind of followed suit, but not very, very carefully. Up until that time, mostly pictures of the West and pleasant scenes that make people happy. And all of a sudden, the WPA came along and painted a very negative picture of the United States. Of course, there were a lot of people who were lefties at the time. Didn't go along with the system the way it had been designed. And so you had a burst of energy that came out. Unfortunately, a lot of the work that was done by WPA artists was sold for 10 cents on the dollar. But some really creative work came out of it. It really gave a chance to put itself on the map as an art colony. It was a very good stimulating program in encouraging the arts during the Depression, just to put people to work. The stipends were very small, enough just to keep families alive. And I think there was kind of a brotherhood among WPA artists that they were doing something for a cause, which is to rebuild America.
Very good.
It was really amazing. And of course, the art colony in Taos and in Santa Fe was noted and still is today. My father was not a part of that, but he knew many of the artists that worked there. Today they have a very modern museum in Roswell. And interestingly enough, last time I visited there, just to see what they had on file on my dad, I discovered a series of black and white pictures just outside the gift shop. And as I was walking along the corridor there, woman said, "Yeah, we've had those up for a number of years. We don't know who the person is." I said, "That was my dad, black and white."
And what was your father's name?
Jan Marfyak. That's my name. My father is Jan, so the way it's pronounced, in Slovak.
Okay, Jan.
I have most of his works that I've accumulated over the years. He died at the age of 82 in Washington, D.C., where we were both living at the time. He married my mother, whom he met at the art student league in New York, and she was a watercolorist. And I have some of her pictures. He had several exhibits over the years and sold a few of his works, but that was the extent of it. He painted more because he loved painting than he did for profit or fame. He was the kind of person he was. Thoroughly versed in the ancient writers and painters. He could describe various schools of art and was fascinated with experimental kinds of things. He had a line of paintings that were called shadowgraphs, in which he projected shadow images onto canvas and then filled them in with color and extended them into a theme. He did one interesting painting of one of the Shakespearean sonnets using somebody's shorthand as the basis for the whole poem.
That's very, Shakespeare, shadowgraphs. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, he went through a variety of phases. I think he was very much influenced by an early gallery study in the turn of the century, and abstraction was his kind of key to the game, and color, contrasting them. Some of his stuff is very striking. He is very creative, but he moved easily in the art field. And of course, when he lived in Washington, D.C., he haunted the galleries. Articulate on the subjects of many of his colleagues that were professional. One interesting story, Kathy, is I was giving a talk on transitional art during the Depression, and there was a young woman in the audience who I thought was rather eager for my remarks. Came up to me after my little talk and said, "What did your father do after the war?" And I said, "Well, he worked for the front organization, the OSS, which of course was a precursor to the CIA. Very unlikely for an artist to do that." And she said, "So did my father work for the same agency. What did he do for them?" And I said, "He did the bomb charts of Italy." She said, "My father was a WP artist. He was your dad's supervisor."
Oh my gosh.
It's a small world when you come
that?
down here. It's really remarkable. So I would say, that I like his art. I think it makes a lot of sense. It was experimental in many ways. But the important thing is he enjoyed painting. He loved it. Talked about it. He did it. And it was the kind of thing that you'd expect a teacher or a professor to go into it some way. But he was one of the most enthusiastic boosters of Franklin Roosevelt.
As you are.
As I am. And an admirer of the Vice President, Henry Wallace. I would say my father was a lefty.
Okay.
But not a communist, not a socialist.
And yet he liked FDR.
He did. And of course, we were friends with Russia at that time, and then the Second World War. He at one point volunteered to go to Spain and fight with the loyalists against the fascists that were taking over the government. But my mother told him that he shouldn't go. Couldn't tell a paintbrush from a gun.
Oh my goodness. Oh, a paintbrush from a gun.
He was also a friend of Jackson Pollock, who of course is a certain amount of notoriety in what he was doing. He was constantly at our house. Unfortunately, he did a lot of tippling, and when he did that, my dad followed suit, and my mother objected to that. I've told the story many times to people. I was probably 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7 at the time, and we were living in New York City. Jackson had taken a farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, for the summer and invited us for a weekend. And we went down there by train and then by car. We had an accident on the way to his house. The car ran into a ditch and broke down completely. That night, they put me to bed, and Jackson and my dad started doing tippling, and I heard a lot of giggling. Came downstairs to see what it was about. They were using palette knives to fire paint onto a canvas, smudging it with their fingers and calling it the Battle of Agincourt.
Of what?
Agincourt, or whatever. But it was all done willy-nilly. I suspect that was when Jackson had the idea of doing trip painting.
You have been very valuable member of our organization because you have this history. But what did you think that the Roosevelt WPA program, and of course it was more than art, they put writers to work, and, all the different people that needed jobs, practically everybody. What did you have thought of the FDR programs?
Well, I think probably what the influence was for me was a broader horizon than looking. Most kids aren't brought up in a painting family, and it's very different. They're out of work most of the time and mostly poor. To achieve success is a sort of stroke of luck, and perhaps who you know. But my parents were very much in the avant-garde of education. I went to what was called Little Red Schoolhouse in New York City, which was a precursor to Montessori. And I went to a private school in Massachusetts, and later on to college. But the advantage to me was that they were very progressive. My mother, I think, only had a high school diploma, as did my dad, but they were intent on getting me a thorough education, and it served me well. I was very fortunate over the years to have that.
Did you become an artist?
No, I was never really interested in art. Music, perhaps, but not art. My career was basically with the government. A commitment to people who needed help. I think they came out of my family as a basis for all my life. I've always worked in socially relevant programs and enjoyed it. I never thought really of working in the corporate field. Government has always been my heart. I spent 17 years with the State Department, state government in Wisconsin after I finished my advanced degrees.
In what department?
Political science.
Political science. Where?
But I worked for motor vehicle, health, and finally administration in Wisconsin. And then moved to Washington Department of Justice and worked with later on with the Secretary of Energy, the Department of Energy.
What brought you to New Mexico, of all places?
I think a lot of it had to do with remembrance of New Mexico as a child, and I lived here, for 2 years. Very fond of it. The environment was one dry, good air, and I love the ancient sites that are here and the people. I've lived in a number of states, and I was more comfortable. Have been more comfortable here than most. I never really adapted to Washington, D.C. It was at a different level than I was accustomed to.
Okay, yeah.
Been married several times, mostly to school teachers, and I have also taught at the University of Wisconsin as an adjunct professor. I worked for their extension. Very satisfying experience. I enjoyed it.
What did you teach?
I taught a basic course in state and local government, a course in constitutional law, and civil liberties over the years.
How did you get involved with, you had some knowledge of New Deal. Some of our board members did not have a background or had an interest, but you had a background in New Deal. How did you get involved with us?
My former wife had heard Kathy Flynn speak to the issues of the New Deal, gave me the phone number to call, and she had done a program with PBS, and I joined in right away. Found out what she was doing and said, "Count me in."
And I was sure glad you did.
Kathy's the kind of person that once she gets hold of you, you can't get away. So I've been treasurer for a number of years with the organization. And I'm probably the only member besides Kathy who remembers the New Deal. Most of them are younger than we are.
Oh, right.
I turned 90 about 6 weeks ago, and Kathy and I are both up in age, but we're still working at it to remember what Franklin Roosevelt did. He pulled this country out of abject poverty and put it back on its feet. A magnificent job.
And he started that 90 years ago.
Yeah.
To the day. I mean, we are celebrating the 90th anniversary of all that Roosevelt did.
As you move around New Mexico and the United States, there's an awful lot of stuff that's still here that was built during the Depression.
Oh, gosh.
And is in use. And that's pretty remarkable.
Absolutely. There's buildings that people take for granted, like courthouses and schools and parks and, all of our state and national parks, things like.
I think what the Roosevelt administration did was bring back faith in government. There are efforts to tear it apart, to revoke many of the programs that were put into practice. Social Security, workmen's compensation, unemployment compensation. All those programs were started in the 30s and rebuilt America on a different platform than capitalism was allowing it to run itself. The reason for the crash back in the 30s was people overinvested in a long-time Social Security and these other programs to buttress Americans in their livelihood. People like Ben Chong, who protested by writing pamphlets and doing designs, and said, hey, look, there's another side of the world. We can get back on our feet, and we did. Most people have no idea what the people from Oklahoma and Kansas did during the dust storms that were driven to California. This country was in terrible shape, and Roosevelt was able to counteract much of that.
Like you said, you and I are some of the only ones that will remember, but I sure remember living through those dust storms. They were god awful. I mean, you can't even imagine how. I mean, I was in the 5th grade. I was sitting right next to a window, and we had a dust storm that day, and I couldn't read the print on the book that I was sitting right next to the window. It was so dark because of those dust storms. And of course, what it did to the farmers and ranchers, their lands were just destroyed.
That poverty has been documented in film, in another part of the New York programming. And I encourage people to get on the internet and look at some of the photographs, because it will tell the tale of poverty and the misery that people suffered. And they never lost their truth in the United States. What I think is remarkable is this man from eastern Slovakia came here and made a life. His family, as he admitted, were peasants. They went from growing potatoes and corn to art. It's a big step. Incidentally, my dad, ironically, worked with, Kathy, help me with the name of the woman and of the guy that did the work at the Ellis Island.
I can't help you.
You have a blank. He's a well-known artist. But they repainted the mural on the wall, and of all people, my dad worked on it. So he came through Ellis Island, and he wound up many years later restoring the
that's
works
wonderful.
on the wall.
Wonderful. Well, you have been a great asset to our organization and all that we have done, not only at the national level, but we've done a heck of a lot here in New Mexico, thanks to you.
New Mexico was fortunate. It had abundance of help from the federal government, probably per capita, I understand, more than any other state. And those edifices still stand, many of them.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, you look to those and say, they've withered over time, but they're still useful.
Yeah.
And it's a real credit to the people. And Kathy, you've done a lot to do this.
Oh.
You've devoted your life to it. It's unbelievable how much time you spent working on it. These people shall not be forgotten.
Well, we were very fortunate to have so many good artists in New Mexico and so many good builders and educators and everything that they all benefited from. But we're so proud that you became part of our organization.
Well,
to share about your father and bring that to us.
One concluding story I think you should tell is the building of the Veterans Memorial Hospital in Truth and Consequences and how that got built. Fascinating. The governor at the time was
Clyde Tingley. Thank you very much. Another friend.
Tingley.
Clyde Tingley, yes.
His wife was, the couple lived in Ohio, as I understand it. And she had some breathing problems, and they recommended a dry climate. So she came to New Mexico with her husband. He eventually became a governor of the state, and she went her own way and established a sanitarium in what was then Warm Springs?
Yes, Hot Springs.
Hot Springs.
No, it was not a sanitarium. It was a children's hospital, a polio hospital.
Yes.
Yes, for children.
Kathy tells an interesting story about it. They ran out of money for bricks, and these were being made at the prison here in New Mexico for the building. And Mrs. Tingley, when she was told that there was a deficit, picked up the phone and called Eleanor Roosevelt and got the money that she needed.
That's right. She was, we're talking about Carrie Tingley.
Carrie Tingley.
And she wanted to know how the architects were going to build this building and what they were going to do about it. And one of those architects shared with me when she asked them, "How is my poliomyelitis hospital coming along?" And he said, we all looked down at the floor and went, and finally they said, well, we don't know much about that. And she said, "Where's your phone?" And they took her into an office and she dialed, and the woman at the other end said, "Oh, Carrie, how nice to hear from you. How are things out there in New Mexico?" And Carrie said, "Well, Eleanor, we got a problem." And "What's that?" And she said, "Well, we're wanting to build this hospital for children with polio, but the architects don't know what a polio hospital has to have in it." And Eleanor said, "Well, that's not a problem. I'll get the architect for the Warm Springs, Georgia hospital where Franklin goes all the time, and we'll get them the plans, and you can take care of that." And that's how it all happened. And Eleanor and Carrie. But yes, then they had trouble building the place, and it was finished in 1937 to take care of children with polio. It is now the same facility is serving veterans who need nursing care. So veterans or their family, their spouses or whatnot, can also have service at that facility.
It's very interesting to note that people from the Democratic Party have been concerned about people in the state. Our current government, Michelle, is now putting money into rebuilding the site, as Kathy said, to continue. We owe a real debt of gratitude to our veterans, particularly Vietnam veterans, and she's meeting those. So some progress is being made in that regard, and the Roosevelt tradition is on.
Yes, we're very fortunate.
All right,
Jan, thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed this. I wish we could spend another 2 hours.
Oh, only 2?
Yeah. There's a lot to tell.
Yeah.
But suffice to say that people who worked in WPA programs not only enjoyed them, but I think made a major contribution to our nation.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the artists, it was the musicians and the writers. So all those people that, didn't have a 9-to-5 job or an 8-to-5 job or whatever, they made it this way. Thank you.
All right, onward and upward. I'll be in touch. I've got a ton of work to do yet.